written by Murphy here. I'm doing a book review. I'm doing a book review of The Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. Wow, this was a big book. It took me a long time to finish. A whole week, right? So, the reason I picked up this book is right now, in my native America, where I am from, where I was born, there's a lot of interest in racial things. A lot of people are wearing BLM, meaning Black Lives Matter. Black Lives do matter. And there's conflict. Conflict is a bummer. So what would be an example of another place that had had similar conflict? And how did they do it? And what can I learn from that? So I thought of Nelson Mandela. And I thought, wow, South Africa had some racial conflict. So I wanted to hear what he had to say. And so I picked up Long Walk to Freedom. It was a really good book. Gorgeous, gorgeous story. Wow. Of course, I like reading things to learn something new. I don't know that much about life in Africa, and in particular South Africa. So this taught me a lot about it. It taught me about the history, the 20th century history of South Africa, and the history of the African Nationalist, what do they call it? Nationalist Congress, African National Congress struggle, and what happened. So here's the thing about Nelson Mandela. He was born in 1918 and he died in 2013. He was an old man. He worked to fight against the colonialist racial inequality in South Africa. He's pretty famous, so you might already know this. He was a founding member of the African National Congress, and the African National Congress, created a proposal of what they wanted to have happen for South Africa. And he spent 27 years of his life in jail because of his political beliefs and his commitments. That's a really long time. That's some commitment. He stayed there because he really believed in it. The book, it was a book of history, but it was so first-person beautiful. I got to follow the life of this very interesting man. He's thoughtful. He had adventures. In some ways, it reminded me a bit of the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, because he says, well, I was born and I did these things. And one of the beautiful things, too, is I got to learn about his it starts with him as a young boy and what he thought his life was going to be based on his father and his family's position. I didn't know anything about that. Like, oh, that's so interesting. And he describes what he did and the food that he ate. This was a journey that I got to go on. It was really beautiful. It was long, but it was just pleasurable the whole way through. This book was so beautiful and gorgeous and well done. He had this heritage to be a counselor to the local king. That was what he was going to do. And so he set up his life to do that. He got educated, he became a lawyer, and he stepped away from what he thought he was going to be as a young boy. He could have stayed there and life would have been just fine. But he believed in freedom and equality for all of South Africans, and so he put himself on the line. He was very stubborn. He said he inherited that from his father. He was very stubborn. So as he was working with the rebels to fight the white colonialists who were in power in South Africa, they came up with, they got together, they protested, they arranged for, pushback. They call them not strikes, but stay-at-homes. They wouldn't go to work, and they were rebelling as peacefully. The great majority of what they did was peaceful. Like, wow, that takes commitment, that takes character to do that. And he really believed in making his native country, the place where he was from, where he was born and his family lived, somewhere that was free and just. One of the stories, now, like I said, I don't know that much about Africa. At one point during his pre-imprisonment activist years, he went to Ethiopia to get support from the Ethiopian government. And he said, I had heard about Ethiopia. I wanted to know more about other parts of Africa. Ethiopia was a place of romance for him, a place of romance and history and story. I feel that way about London. I speak English, and I've been to England, I've been to London. I'm like, oh, this is a storied place. So for him, Ethiopia was a storied place, and he saw what it was like. One of the things he saw was that the place in Ethiopia was Black African people. And so it was just Black African. There was not a white ruling class. I was like, oh, that's different. He saw that that's how it could be. He also saw that Ethiopia did not have some of the Western sophisticated structures that the Afrikaners had brought. Stronger buildings, perhaps, like the Western culture made South Africa have some higher quality things than Ethiopia did. So I said, oh, this is interesting. This came up later. What did he say? This is really interesting. As he was pushing for freedom for all races and colors in South Africa, some people criticized, some of the people who were aligned with the Afrikaners said, well, your life is better than the Africans that are in other African countries. And he said, we are not to be compared with other African country people. We should be compared to the white citizens in our own country. He said, that's not a fair comparison. We are all people together in South Africa, and we should be compared to one another in this country that we share. So he was able to understand what that criticism was because he had the opportunity to travel and see. That was very interesting to me. And I thought it was a valid point. Like, no, we are in charge of our country. Let's be equal inside of our own country. He told long stories of what it was like to be in prison. Tragically, this is a common experience for Black Americans too, being in prison. So I wonder if that would be meaningful to Black Americans who are in prison and have to endure long prison sentences. He talked a lot about, I think that his experience in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I think he got out in the early 90s, are a little bit different because the African prisons treated people very differently than our American prisons do. But this is interesting to me. And yeah, it was an experience that I have not had, to be in prison. And eventually, because of his tireless persistence and stubbornness, he was in prison. He had a colleague who was working outside of prison for the cause. and that colleague and other people in the African Party African National Congress, eventually he was freed. And they got their huge ask of one vote for one person. Big deal. All right. Then at the end, I found this very compelling. As he came out of prison, he was greeted with a huge wave of support from the South African community. So glad to welcome him to freedom. And as he was speaking to them, thank you, we believe in South Africa, giving a big speech. And imagine how overwhelming. He'd been in prison for so long, and now he comes out and he's just got this huge crowd of people so happy to see him and cheering him. And he said, after he greeted them at first, he said, I had heard of criminals. And this is what he's saying to the crowd. I had heard of criminals masquerading as freedom fighters, harassing innocent people, and setting alight vehicles. These rogues had no place in the struggle for freedom. These rogues had no place in the struggle. Freedom without civility. Freedom without the ability to live in peace was not freedom at all. He was not letting the citizens of South Africa off the hook. He's saying, don't be rogues. We need to have civility. This is our country. That was very meaningful to me. This book was beautifully written, a gorgeous story, a portrayal of a man who I respect so deeply, so deeply. He changed the world, and he deserves to be honored for all time. He did something heroic and extraordinary. So much respect for Nelson Mandela and for the changes that he brought, his sacrifices and his commitment and his stellar integrity. Now, he was a human being. He talked about his sorrow that he couldn't be there to bury his mother, his sorrow that he wasn't there to see his children grow up and to be there as a husband for his wife. He gave that up for the bigger people, the whole country. What a sacrifice. What a personal sacrifice. He did not go the easy way. It inspires me to be a better person and for me to have commitment and integrity in what I do. What do you think? I'd love to hear what you think of Mandela and what you think of my view of this book. Let me know. Let's keep the conversation going.